So the Cornerstone Awards were created to recognize the people behind businesses that have had an impact on our community, either by the people they serve, they employ, or even how they help put Belleville on the map. And your father, today I'm joined by Rob Haggarty, and his father, Max, was one of those people. Unfortunately, you lost him back in August, and so did we, obviously. Before we had a chance to thank him for the work he did to build ITS to an organization that employs 625 people and supports the transportation of goods across the country internationally.
Yes.
So you're here to help tell that story, which really started with your grandfather. I'm going to kind of let you go on with that, but your father started driving for the family business at 15. Was it? I don't even want to know if that was allowed, but he'd go from here to Windsor, do that. Mentioned about the 401 not even being there. Anyway, but it was your grandfather's passing in 1960 that really propelled the business forward, with your dad kind of coming on board with your Uncle Harold. I'm going to let you go from there and tell us a little bit about Max Haggarty.
Okay, thanks, Jill. Yeah, my dad grew into the business because his father had started a truck company in Wooler in, I think, the 1940s. And so my dad quit school in grade 9. Started driving truck. I don't know, probably wasn't legal, but I don't think licenses, I think they were an option back then, perhaps. And he used to tell me how he would drive to Windsor and back. And of course, there was no 401, it was Highway 2, stoplights, towns all the way. Took 2 days to get to Windsor and back. And it must have just been an awful trip in the old trucks. There was a place, if you drive down, take Highway 2 through Newcastle. And if you drive that route, there's an old railroad bridge, and it's only one vehicle can go through each direction if you know it. And it's called Hole in the Wall. And back in the day, years ago, when the trucks, there's a hill on either side, so the truck would come over the hill, he'd see a truck come over the other hill, and it'd be a race to get through Hole in the Wall. My dad used to tell me those stories, and I'm like, God, that must have been crazy dangerous. But anyway, so my dad worked for his father and my dad's brother, Harold. And Harold was about 9 years older than my dad. And Harold was the apple of his father's eye. My dad was kind of the runt. And my dad never really got along well with his father, unfortunately. And then my grandfather, his father, his name was Nesbitt, he died in 1960 at the age of 60. That gave Max an opportunity because now it was he and Harold that had the business. And my dad was 24 at the time. And as I say, Harold was about 33. They took off. And that, back then it was called Haggarty Transport. They bought a few other companies, became Lafferty Smith Express Lines. And so they went through the 60s and the 70s. And they had a great run. The one story, I mentioned the 401, but when they were starting to build the 401 back in the mid-50s, they didn't know where they're going to put the exit ramps because there'd been no traffic studies done, and traffic studies were probably fairly new back then. So they set up
They didn't have consultants yet.
They didn't have consultants yet, where they could spend piles of government money on. So they set up traffic counters on the different roadways that were going to intersect the highway. And then they were going to study the traffic counters to say, where are we going to put exits? Well, my dad and my Uncle Harold, on many occasions, he told me, would go down there at night, and usually on the weekend with a bottle of whiskey, and would sit there and jump up and down or stand on this thing over and over, those hoses.
Yes, like they used to have at the gas stations.
Like they used to have at the gas stations, and drive the counter up. And
so if anybody wonders why,
because they wanted an exit, because the company was in Wooler. And so you came down Wooler Road, and they wanted an exit at Wooler Road and the 401. Of course, they got an exit at Wooler Road and the 401. Now, I don't know if it had anything to do with it, but when you think about it, why was there an exit at Wooler Road?
Yes,
there was no
they must
town
have thought
there.
Trenton was going to get that much bigger a long time ago.
I mean, there was no town, and so they did that. So he told me the story. They had a good run through the 70s, and then Max and Harold ended up selling the company in 1976.
Okay.
So.
And that was the Lafferty Smith Express? Or?
That was Lafferty Smith. Mm-hmm. They sold it in 1976.
Okay, and then what did your dad do after that?
Well, he lived high and large for a few years, and then he realized he better get back to work. because he was spending what he'd made in the sale, I guess, of the company, and that was something he regretted doing. He told me he didn't want to go into debt. His brother, as I said, who was older and wasn't in the greatest of health, and his brother wanted to get out of the business. So his brother said, "Why don't you buy my half out?" And my dad said, "I don't want to go that much into debt. I'm afraid of the debt. I don't want to do it." So they sold the company instead. And my dad told me the next day, he cried, "I've made a mistake. I shouldn't have done that." But he did. So then he carried on for a few years spending. That's when he really got into boating.
Okay.
So,
well, there, you know what they say, break out another 1,000.
That's right. That's right. So he had to get off the trucking side. So he started with a small boat when I was a kid, and then he grew up, and it's like 1 foot itis with boats, and it finished. He had a 60-foot Chris Craft Roamer that he would take back and forth from Fort Lauderdale to Alex Bay, New York, every season. He and
That's
my mother.
A phenomenal trip.
Yeah, I think it was like 3 weeks to do it, 2 to 3 weeks.
Right.
They had a great time doing it. I went on a half of a leg once. I went from Fort Lauderdale to Norfolk, Virginia once to see what it was like, and it was really something. And often they had a crew of characters. So sometimes my mother wasn't on the boat, and they'd have people like Bill Vaughn or Lee Rackham or others. And Fred Deacon, these are names from the past, these guys that like to party, and they had some good times. For sure. So.
Yes, and would this have been about the time that he then got really involved? Like he was involved with the Ontario Trucking Association.
Right. So he was elected the president of the Ontario Trucking Association in, I think, about 1975. He was the youngest member they'd ever had to that point. He was 36, I guess, roughly, and that was quite a time.
Right. He was pretty committed to the industry.
He was really committed to the industry, and he had to go to the OTA in Toronto. Like he would drive to Toronto certainly 3 to 4 times a week for business or to meet OTA meetings. And he was president, chairman for 2 years, so that was a busy period for him for sure.
Sure, and he gave a lot of himself to the community as well. I mean, I know he was a big part of the chamber, which is partly why we don't want to forget his impact, because he was huge. He was
big in the local community, as you mentioned, Chamber of Commerce. I remember being Sales and Ad Club, Belleville Shriners, Waterfront Festival. I remember as a kid, we lived on a Northwood Crescent, and he'd be going out he'd be going to something. There was something going on every night that he was going to, and I always wanted to go with him. I was probably about 4 years old, and he'd say, "No, you can't go with me."
He was having way too much fun.
He was having way too much fun.
Right. So then ITS, when does that come into the picture?
So then he worked for a couple of different companies, and then he started ITS in 1987. And he had like one truck, and he was kind of in a period in his life where he'd lived high, he'd sold Lafferty Smith, he'd had a number of years of good times. And then he had to get back to work, and then when he had to go back to work, he was like starting over. Like he was in a tough spot. And they had one truck, and then it grew to 8 or 10, and then when I joined, I came down from Toronto in 1998, and we were up to about 36 trucks. So, and he and I worked together. We got along so well, and I learned something from my dad: don't carry a grudge. We can't do it. And he and I, like, we worked together, ran the company for 23 years together, and we'd have arguments, and they would be a little bit vicious at times, but he'd leave my office and come back, or I'd go back to his office 10 minutes later. Oh, I wanted to ask you about something else. Change the topic, forget about it. We're not going to argue about why did we buy those trailers or how come we don't have that account. We just moved on. And that was the way he was. He was great that way, and I learned it from him. So I'm appreciative of that.
Oh, that's fantastic. And that's the element of a founder. It's really being able to take something from the ground up. So, I mean, he had the opportunity to learn with his brother, but then to be able to start all over and do it again, that's pretty phenomenal. And like you say, 600 employees, 625. Yep. How many trucks?
About 400.
Right.
Yeah.
That it's a great story. know that now you're going to be saying goodbye to the legacy that he left, and that's, I mean, I suppose good news for you because you get to retire now.
Yeah.
Or are you going to start something new yourself?
No, not, well, I might, but it won't be trucking. I mean, I grew up in this business, you know, with my grandfather and my father and my uncle, and I have other cousins that were in the business. And when you grow up that way, it's like, okay, it's all I know in all my life. But it's like, okay, I've been doing it for 61 years of some way, form, or another. Studied it in university, and I'm like, nah, I'm done with it. I've had enough.
Great. Well, and you have this great little picture. Can we pull this picture up?
So this was a picture that was taken on a slide about 1972 in front of Lafferty Smith up in Belleville on Bellevue Drive. That's my uncle. That's my father and some of the key staff. And I remember my dad telling me when this picture was taken, I was just a kid, he said, "You see the picture?" I went, "Yeah." He goes, "You notice how I'm standing with my body to the camera?" So he says, "My belly doesn't stick out like your uncle's." But he was, he was big in supporting the area and the waterfront festival, Folklorama.
Yes.
When we used to be able to call it.
We revived that this year with curbside culture.
Right,
for sure.
and then I remember he and Gary Reed co-chaired it, I think 1 or 2 years, and you and I were speaking about this shortly ago, that when they built the Bay Bridge, the new Bay Bridge in Belleville, it didn't have any street lights on it. It was dark, it was a dark bridge, and people said, they spend all this money, they don't put street lights. So Gary and Max, the money they raised off waterfront, they put street lights on it back mid-'80s. It was that long ago. Yes, okay.
So your father had, I mean, beyond the founding of ITS, after he had sold the other business, your dad was big and large around the community. What was his signature?
Well, he loved to sit and visit with people. And he'd like to go to Earl and Angelo's and sit at the chef's table, and he would, no matter who was beside him, it didn't matter if it was a multimillionaire or a bricklayer. Mm-hmm. He would talk, he just wanted to hear the story. And Max didn't talk. He just said, "Hi, I'm Max. What's your name and what do you do?" And he just wanted to hear the story. And he loved hearing stories like that. He met so many people doing that. And in fact, through the Earl and Angelo's period, he named a drink after himself. So a double Grey Goose on the rocks without fruit is a Max. And I found that out one day. I went out for lunch with him about 10 years ago. He says, "Let's go to Earl and Angelo's." I said, "All right." He walked in and he goes, "I'll have a Max. He'll have one too." So the other thing is, because he was like this larger-than-life character and so many people knew of him, years ago, Linda, his wife, was in a donut shop in Florida, coffee shop, picking up coffee. And she gets talking to a guy standing in line. And she says, he says, "Where are you from?" She goes, "Oh, I'm from Ontario." And this guy says, "I only know one Canadian, and his name is Max Haggarty." And she's like, "You've got to be kidding." Like, it's just the way he was. Everybody knew the guy, and he just loved to visit. And he would sit there at the bar or the table, and you'd be like, if you were with him, you were like, I might as well find somewhere else to go. Because he just was so entertained with the other person's story, right?
Thank you so much for sharing that. I know it would have been great to have him tell some of the story. We might have been here for a lot longer. So thank you for sharing your dad.
Oh, thanks very much, Jill. I miss him every day. Thank you.